On a quiet street in Greenwich Village, an old man in a worn bathrobe shuffles past a crooked tree. To most neighbours, he is just another tired soul talking to himself under the streetlights. To the men watching from an unmarked car, he is the rumoured boss of the most careful crime family in New York. Tonight we are going to follow his slow steps backward through time. From the tenements of Thompson Street to smoky boxing halls, from backrooms and secret meetings to hospital corridors and a long-running performance that fooled almost everyone. Settle in, breathe easy, and let the city lights dim. This is the calm crime story of Vincent Gigante, the odd father who tried to hide in plain sight. Chapter 1. Night Watch in the Village. The car had been there so many nights that the neighbours stopped seeing it. It rested by the curb on Sullivan Street under a crooked tree that had learned to grow around telephone wires and forgotten promises. The paint on the unmarked sedan was a soft city grey, the kind that collected the dull shine of streetlights and gave nothing back. Inside, two men sat in the slow warmth of the heater, sharing the patient silence of people who had spent too many nights watching the same doorway. The older one was named Marlowe. His coat was a little too big, his tie a little too loose, and his notebook was thick with years of scribbles that only he could truly read. The younger one was named Russo. His jacket still had hard edges from the store, and he held a paper cup of coffee like it might try to escape. They were not supposed to call it a stakeout anymore. It was surveillance. Professional, methodical, carefully logged. But the feeling was the same as every old story: two tired men in quiet street, and the sense that at any moment something important might happen and then pretend not to be important at all. Marlowe lifted his chin toward the building across the street. "He is late tonight," he said. Russo checked the time on his watch, then remembered the file and stopped himself. "Late for what?" he asked. "His evening stroll to talk with parking meters." Marlowe gave a soft snort. "You will see," he said. "There is a timing to it. Even crazy men have routines." Across the way, the apartment building looked peaceful, the way only New York buildings can look peaceful, which is to say not peaceful at all if you listened closely. Pipes hummed, someone laughed behind a wall, television light blinked through curtains, and a baby somewhere made short, uncertain sounds like a trumpet learning to play. Russo looked down at the thick folder open on his lap. The name on the front was written in heavy letters by some clerk who probably never saw the man in person. Vincent Gigante. He tapped the paper lightly with one finger. "So," he said, "the great and powerful boss, the man who terrifies half the city, and we are supposed to stare at his front door because he might go out in a bathrobe." Marlowe shrugged, eyes still on the entrance. "That is the assignment," he said. "Watch him. Log everything." No matter how silly it seems. Between them, a small recorder sat on the dashboard, a red light winking faintly. It listened better than either of them, but it did not understand what it heard. That part was still on the two men in the car. The night was not cold enough for snow, but the air had a damp edge that hung under the streetlights. Somewhere nearby, a siren started, gained courage, and then faded into another part of the city. Russo sipped his coffee, made a face, and rolled the window down a crack. "You ever think they are playing us?" he asked. "Like maybe the show is for our benefit?" Marlowe smiled. "You read the file, kid," he said. "He has been playing everyone for decades." The front door of the building opened. Both men straightened without speaking. The recorder on the dashboard hummed on, indifferent and alert. A figure stepped out into the faint glow of the street lamp. He moved slowly, as if measuring the ground with each foot. He wore a bathrobe that might once have been white, now the colour of old paper. Underneath it, a thin shirt and pyjama pants. On his feet, soft slippers that looked like they had known many floors. On his head, a small knit cap sat at an angle, more practical than stylish. His hair peeked out in tired grey wisps. His shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight no one could see. Vincent Gigante shuffled onto the sidewalk, blinked at the world, and began to walk. Russo stared. "You have got to be kidding," he whispered. Marlowe did not laugh this time. He simply picked up the notepad, clicked his pen, and began to write. Subject exits residence, he murmured as he wrote, wearing bathrobe, slippers, knit cap. Appears disoriented. Time is just after midnight. Route, as always, unknown. Vincent stopped beside a parking meter, leaned close to it, and seemed to have a quiet argument with the air. He lifted done hand as if making a point, then let it fall. He shook his head, muttered something no one could hear from the car, and shuffled on. The scene had the gentle absurdity of a late-night comedy sketch. An old man in a worn robe, slippers whispering on the sidewalk, talking to metal poles and empty corners. But the street around him did not laugh. The village had grown used to stranger things. Rousseau watched, torn between disbelief and a very specific kind of unease. "He really does it," he said softly. "I thought maybe it was exaggerated in the reports." Marlowe kept writing. "He has been at it for years," he said, robe muttering, the whole confused act. Doctors, hospitals, evaluations, the file is full of it. "Then why are we here?" Rousseau asked. "If he is really that far gone, why does anyone still care?" "Because sometimes," Marlowe said without looking up, "they forget to act." Vincent paused at the corner and stared up at the night sky as if expecting an answer there. A cab turned onto the street, slowed, saw him, and then rolled by. The driver gave a quick glance and then went back to minding the road. There were plenty of things to look at in New York. An old man in a bathrobe was almost comforting. Lights glowed in narrow windows over the street. On Montsill, someone had left a small plant that had given up growing and was now trying to endure. Laundry lines crisscrossed the air like quiet arguments between neighbours. Marlowe tapped the file with his pen. "Anyway," he said, "this is just the last chapter. Everything in this folder is the long version of why someone like him can walk around like that while the rest of this city keeps its head down." Rousseau closed the folder for a moment and watched Vincent move on, a slow figure drifting past closed doors, every step measured, every gesture loose and unthreatening. "He looks like somebody's confused uncle," Rousseau said. Marlowe shook his head once. "He is the boss of the Genovese family," he said. "Or was, or might be. That is the problem. The lines are very blurry." The car settled back into its own silence, and the night of Greenwich Village wrapped itself around all three of them. One man in a bathrobe, two in an unmarked car, and a city that preferred to keep its most interesting stories inside. Vincent turned the corner and moved out of their direct line of sight, but they knew the route by heart. Down the block, pause at the church, sometimes sit on a stoop, sometimes double back and stare at the same doorway as if surprised to find it still A. Rousseau opened the file again. The top pages were all about doctors and clinics, test results and muttered phrases. Deeper down, the paper changed. Old clippings, typed reports, yellowed photographs. A young man with boxing gloves. A courtroom drawing of a tall figure at a defense table. Names that had echoed through the city for half a century. It was all supposed to add up to top person. "Maybe," Rousseau said, "the file is the costume and the man in the robe is the truth." Marlowe looked at him for the first time in a while. "Or," he said, "maybe the robe is the costume and the file is closer to the truth than anybody wants to admit." The night did not answer. It rarely did. Across the street, in a small deli that kept late hours for the benefit of insomniac artists and shift workers, the owner watched Vincent go by through the glass. He shook his head, then went back to arranging loaves of bread in soft, perfect lines. Upstairs, behind an old lace curtain, an elderly woman turned off her television and moved to the window out of habit. She saw the figure in the bathrobe and made the sign of the cross, not entirely sure whether it was for him or for herself, and then she went to bed. On the top floor, a young painter sat in front of a blank canvas, listening to music through cheap headphones. From time to time he glanced down and caught a glimpse of the old man shuffling past. He had been telling himself for years that he would paint that scene. He never did. The city watched Vincent Gigante, and Vincent, in his own way, watched the city back, even when his eyes seemed to slide past everything. Rousseau closed the folder carefully, as if the papers inside were very light and might float away. "Tell me the beginning," he said, before the bathrobe. Marlowe rested the notepad on his knee and stretched his fingers. He had been waiting for that question. They all asked it in the end. The beginning, he said, is a boy named Vincenzo, on a block not far from here, with a father who fixed watches and a mother who trusted the church more than the police, and a city that was still learning how to hide its secrets in plain sight. Rousseau settled deeper into his seat, the coffee cooling in his hands. The recorder on the dashboard kept humming, catching the soft creaks of the car and the distant thrum of traffic, and outside, the figure in the bathrobe turned another corner on a path laid down many years before. "Tell me," Rousseau said. Marlowe looked out at the street one more time, as if making sure the old man would finish his slow circuit without incident. Then he began. He was born just a couple of blocks from here, he said, in a crowded apartment near Thompson Street. His father was named Salvatore. He fixed tiny, stubborn gears all day and hoped his sons would do anything else. His mother sewed, prayed, and tried to keep 5 boys pointed toward the right kind of trouble. Rousseau nodded, eyes drifting between the doorway and the folder, as the past slowly opened like another file laid across his lap. Outside, Vincent moved through the quiet streets of Greenwich Village, his robe swaying gently around his legs, slippers whispering over cracked pavement, performing a role that had taken decades to perfect. Chapter 2. The Kid from Thompson Street. Thompson Street in those days smelled of a dozen different lives sharing the same thin slice of air. There was the dark, rich scent of coffee rising from a corner cafe that barely had room for its own door. There was the thick sweetness of bread baking in basement ovens, slipping up through iron grates like a promise. Cooked garlic and frying onions drifted from windows, and the sour ghost of old wine bottles lingered near the trash cans. In the middle of all that stood a narrow building that leaned into its neighbours like a tired man resting on a friend. Inside was the Gigante family. Salvatore, the father, sat most days at a small table near the single window that faced the street. The light never quite reached the back of the room, but it was enough for him. He hunched over watches brought to him by neighbours who trusted his eyes more than they trusted the clock on the church tower. Tiny gears, thin springs, delicate screws. His thick fingers moved with surprising grace, coaxing order back into machines that had given up. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. The ticking filled the little apartment with a steady rhythm, and the boys understood that their father spoke mostly with silences. Their mother, Yolanda, turned those silences into a home. She sewed for wealthier families downtown, stitching their lives together by hand. On Sundays she made the boys line up for church, straightening collars, licking her thumb to chase away smudges they had earned in the street below. The middle son, Vincenzo, had a habit of watching everything and saying very little. As a child, his eyes were large and serious, the way a watch face looks when it has already counted too many hours. He shared one small bedroom with his brothers. At night, they would argue about who got the bed closest to the window, the what square of glass that let in a slice of sky. The oldest brother, Pasquale, made sure no argument went too far. The youngest, Louis, sometimes fell asleep with a small prayer book open on his chest. Later, Louis would become Father Louis, the priest who stood at the altar while one of his brothers quietly rearranged pieces of the neighborhood. For now, they were just boys who ran the stairs too fast, who chased each other past open doors, who knew the sound of every neighbor by the way they coughed or laughed. The street outside their building was its own kind of church. You could learn as much about faith there as you did in the pews, though the faith was in different things. Men leaned in doorways and believed in the power of a strong handshake. Women leaned on windowsills and believed in the power of a strong word. Children believed in the power of running fast enough to escape being caught. Vincenzo watched them all. On Sunday mornings, Yolanda marched them to Mass at a church not far away, insisting that no son of hers would skip to one place where she felt completely seen. The bells called them from the street, and the boys filed in with their hair combed and their shoes as clean as the building could spare water to make them. Years later, people would talk about Vincent Gigante as if he had sprung fully formed from the shadows of a social club, already quiet and dangerous and wrapped in half-truths. But the truth began here, in a small pew, with a boy who folded his hands and tried to keep his younger brother from nudging him with a knee. After church, the world changed. On the steps outside, men waited who did not bother going in. They smoked and talked, greeting everyone with warm words that carried a slight weight. They knew the names of every child, every mother, every landlord. They helped with rent when a father fell ill. They arranged work when a son needed his first job. They did all this with smiles and light touches on the shoulder. Vincenzo saw how people leaned toward them, how his mother lowered her eyes politely when one of the men spoke to his father, how his father answered with careful respect. "That is family," his father would say later at the dinner table when the children asked. "Family in this country means more than your own blood. It means the people who look out for you when the law looks the other way." He said it as if it were a simple fact, like telling the time. But in the silence that followed, the ticking of the watches on the shelf took on a different tone. Vincenzo played on the sidewalk with other boys, their games a mix of baseball, stickball, and invented rules no one could remember by the next day. He was not the loudest or the bravest, but he had a knack for staying in the center of things without drawing attention to himself. If a ball broke a window, someone else usually got blamed. If two boys fought, Vincenzo somehow ended up standing between them, talking softly until they forgot what started the argument. It was not that he hated trouble. He simply preferred that it move in directions he could predict. One afternoon, when he was in his early teens, he followed his father to a small back room behind a local shop. A man there had a watch that had belonged to his own father. It had stopped working years before, and he had carried it in his pocket like a secret. Salvatore opened the case, peered at the inner workings, and began his quiet dance with the tools. While he worked, the other men in the room talked in low voices about shipments and prices, about boats on the river and trucks that moved at night. They never said anything plainly, but even as a boy, Vincenzo caught the shape of their words. He understood that there were two maps of his neighborhood. One was printed on paper and showed streets and parks and schools. The other was drawn in the minds of men like these, lines of influence and quiet debts, favors owed and favors waiting to be called in. When they left the shop, his father walked in silence for half a block. "Do not repeat what you hear in rooms like that," he said finally, "not even at home." Vincenzo nodded. "Yes, Papa," he said. His father looked at him for a long moment. "You have good ears," he said. "You listen more than you talk. That can be a blessing, or it can be something else. You understand." Vincenzo did not entirely, but he was good at nodding. He nodded again. Years later, in courtrooms and conference rooms and hospital corridors, that same habit of listening more than speaking would make judges wonder if he understood anything at all. For now he was just a boy walking home beside a man who fixed broken time. The first time Vincenzo stepped into a boxing gym, he was surprised by how much it sounded like his father's workbench. There was the quick snap of jump ropes, the steady thump of gloves on bags, the little squeaks of shoes on canvas. All of it created a rhythm that pulled him in, the way the ticking of watches had always filled the apartment. The gym was up a narrow flight of stairs above a shop that sold cheap suits. The air was thick with sweat and liniment and pride. Posters curled at the edges on the walls, showing fighters with hard faces and taped hands. A friend from the block had brought him. The friend was convinced that boxing was his ticket off the street and into something cleaner, brighter. He had the loud mouth and the quick grin of boys who have not yet met the limits of their own courage. Vincenzo, in contrast, moved through the room with quiet eyes. The trainer, a thick-shouldered man with a nose that looked like it had been broken a few times and then put back together by someone in a hurry, watched the boys try on gloves. "You got good balance, kid," he told Vincenzo, after watching him throw a few awkward combinations. "You do not rush. You do not flirt with the mirror. I like that." The name Chin arrived slowly, like most nicknames in the neighborhood. Some said it came from his mother's way of calling him, a soft version of Vincenzino that had been shortened and tangled until it came out as Chin. In the ring, it fit. He took hits well. He could stand there, blinking, while someone else emptied their energy on his guard. Then he would answer with a few measured punches of his own, never more than necessary. He was not the fastest, he was not the strongest, but there was something stubborn in the way he held his ground, how he refused to show fear or anger. To the men at the gym, and to the ones who watched from the doorway with more expensive suits, that was worth noting. At home, his mother eyed the bruises with growing unease. "You do not need to let men hit you to prove you are strong," she said, dabbing his cheek with a wet cloth. "It is sport, Ma," he said. "People pay money to watch. It is honest." She made a sound that suggested she trusted boxing no more than she trusted certain men who lingered on the church steps. His father said little, but once, late at night, Vincenzo heard him speaking softly to Louis in the next room. "Your brother has a talent," Salvatore said, "but the world he is walking toward is not gentle. Pray for him." Louis, who was already spending more time in the church than in the street, murmured an answer that Vincenzo could not hear. In the gym, the fights got tougher. In small halls in New Jersey and at St. Nicholas Arena, Chin climbed into the ring under lights that made his skin look pale and his eyes even darker. The crowds shouted and cursed and cheered, the managers argued in corners, the trainers wrapped hands and whispered last-minute advice that sounded very much like the first-minute advice. Do not drop your guard, do not lose your head, do not forget who is watching. It was not just the paying crowd. In the shadows of the halls, men from the neighborhood stood together, their suits better pressed than most, their shoes shined, their attention sharp. They watched how he moved, how he listened to the corner, how he handled winning and losing. They watched more than his jab, they watched his temper, his patience, his ability to take a hit and still look calm. One evening, after a hard fight that left his ribs aching and his face puffed in strange places, Chin sat on a wooden bench in the locker room, staring at the floor. He had won, technically. The decision had gone his way. But he knew, in the quiet space inside his own head, that he was not walking toward any championship. There were boys younger than him, already faster, stronger, more natural in the ring. A man in a dark overcoat stepped into the doorway. He was not the trainer. He was not a promoter. Chin had seen him before, at the church steps and outside the social club that called itself a civic association, and never used the word that everyone else whispered at home. "Tough night," the man said. Chin nodded. "It is a living," he answered. The man gave a small smile. "There are easier ways to make a living," he said. "Ways where you do not have to let strangers hit you in the face. Ways where your kind of patience pays off better." Chin did not answer right away. He knew enough already to understand that a conversation like this was not about finding a new job at the grocery. "I am listening," he said at last. That response seemed to please the man. "Good," he said. "Some of us are always in need of reliable young men, not loud ones, not wild ones, the quiet kind, the kind who know how to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut." Chin glanced at his own reflection in the metal of a locker door. The boy from Thompson Street, the son of a watchmaker and a seamstress, looked back at him with tired eyes and a bruised cheek. He could see several futures there. A few more years of taking punches in small halls for small money, a slow drift into being another man telling stories at the bar about how he almost made it, or something else, something that had already been whispering in his ear every time he walked past the social club where older men nodded and smiled and watched him with interest. Sometimes the city does not push you into a new life with a big dramatic moment. Sometimes it just opens a door a little wider and waits to see if you will step through. Chin stood up slowly, ribs protesting. "I will finish this season of fights," he said. "Then we will talk." The man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Take your time," he said. "Time is something we understand very well." When the man left, the trainer came back in with a roll of tape and a bottle of liniment. "You did good tonight, kid," he said. "You got heart. You can go places if you keep at it." Chin smiled politely, his face already starting to swell. "Thank you," he said. But inside he was counting something else. Not his wins and losses in the ring, but the number of times men in good suits had stepped just close enough to suggest that his real future was elsewhere. On Thompson Street, The nights seemed a little shorter now. The bells of the church still rang, the watches in his father's hands still ticked, his mother still sewed late into the evening. But in his own head another rhythm had begun, one that followed the quiet steps of men who never needed to raise their voices to change the direction of a city block. Years later, when old neighbours shook their heads and said they could not believe that little Chin from Thompson Street had become the quiet power behind a crime family, others would say they had always known. You could see it in the way he watched, they would say. He did not look at things the way other boys did. He counted the seconds between bell and bell. In the middle of all those stories, the boy himself slipped from view. He turned into the man in the bathrobe on Sullivan Street, the legend in the case files, the subject of late-night stakeouts and whispered conversation. But under all of that, there was still a kid whose first lessons in timing came from his father's careful hands and the ticking of broken watches brought back to life. Chapter 3: The Boxer and the Back Room. In the retelling, it always sounds like the moment was sharp and clear, a single turn left instead of right. In truth, it took years. Chin kept fighting. Small purses, small hauls, a record that looked respectable enough on paper. He trained in the same cramped gyms, wrapped his hands with the same ritual, listened to the same trainers telling him that his big break was just one good bout away. But something had shifted after that quiet talk in the locker room. He began to notice who stood in the doorways. Some of the men who watched him had the easy slouch of gamblers. They liked the thrill more than the people in the ring. Others had a stillness that did not belong to any ordinary fan. They talked in low voices, moved in loose group, and carried themselves with the unhurried confidence of people who knew they would not be the ones searched at the door. They were from the neighbourhood, but they were also something beyond it. Their names passed through conversations in the street, the way certain songs passed through the radio. You could not escape hearing them, even if you never saw the records they were pressed on. In the locker room after the wet fight, Chin sat with a towel over his shoulders, while the trainer pressed ice against a bruise on his ribs. Sweat cooled on his skin, leaving him shivering a little. A man stepped in. Not the same from the first talk, but cut from the same cloth. Dark suit, nothing flashy, polished shoes, a small gold ring that caught the light when he gestured. "Good work tonight," he said. Chin nodded once. "Thank you," he answered. "You keep your head even when you are taking shots," the man went on. "Not everybody can do that. Some boys get rattled. Some boys get angry and stupid. You stay calm." Chin said nothing. The trainer, pretending not to eavesdrop, took a sudden interest in refolding a towel. "Calm is useful in other lines of work," the man continued. "Sometimes more useful than in a ring." Chin lifted his eyes. "What kind of work?" he asked. The man smiled a little. "The helpful kind," he said. "Errands, messages, introductions. You know how it is. This city runs on people who can be trusted to show up on time and keep their mouths closed." He did not say what kind of messages. That was part of the language. You did not talk directly about such things. You let the space between words carry the meaning. Chin thought about the watches on his father's table, all those tiny moving parts depending on each other. In the neighbourhood, men like this were the ones who kept the real time. "I already run errands," he said. "For my family. For the gym." The man nodded. "This would be the same," he said lightly, "just with better envelopes." He let the sentence sit there, easy and harmless on the surface. Later, in the street, Chin found himself walking a little slower past the Triangle Civic Improvement Association, the social club that liked to present itself as a community group. The windows were half-curtained. Inside, men sat at small tables playing cards, sipping coffee. The place looked ordinary enough. If you did not know the names of the people inside, you might think it was any club for men who did not want to go home yet. He knew better. One afternoon he accepted an invitation to step in. The room smelled of espresso and old smoke. A television in the corner played a game with the sound turned low. On one wall there were photographs of politicians shaking hands, of smiling men at charity events, of parades and feast days. A heavy-set man with a wide face and calm eyes sat at a central table. Others drifted around him, bringing news, listening for instructions that never sounded like instructions. People called him Fat Tony, though never to his face. His proper name was Anthony, and he was the kind of man other men watched. Chin felt their glances as he entered, a few nods, a few appraising looks. The man in the centre gave him a small smile, then returned to his cards. The first errands were simple. Take this envelope to a man in a bar near the river. Carry this package to a tailor in Midtown. Walk with this friend to a meeting. Always small, always quiet. The pay tucked into his hand afterward was more than he earned for rounds in small fights. The work suited his habits. He was used to keeping his guard up, to watching the eyes of an opponent, to moving his feet so that he could not be easily cornered. Those skills worked just as well on city streets and in back rooms as they did inside the ropes. The men at the club liked that he listened more than he spoke. When he did talk, it was to ask practical questions. What time, he would say. Which entrance? How should I dress? He never asked why, and that was noted. Boxing, which had once been the centre of his world, became a kind of side job. The men at the club sometimes came to his matches, not to bet, but to be seen supporting a local boy. Their presence also served another purpose. When they sat in the first few rows, other people in the hall took notice. The pressure to keep fighting came not only from the gym, but from the small economy that had grown around him. Train harder, the coach would say. A few more wins and you will start getting the bigger bouts. In the corner of the gym, another man would say something different. You know, there is a shipment coming in next month and we could use someone reliable at the dock. 2 lives, side by side, sharing the same hours. In time, one of them began to crowd the other out. The last fight, when it came, did not announce itself as such. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic closing scene. It was just another match in another small hall, lights glaring, crowd shouting. Chin moved through the rounds with his usual patience. He took some hits, gave some in return, found the rhythm of his opponent and adjusted. The decision could have gone either way. It went to him. His corner clapped him on the back, telling him he had done well. In the locker room afterward, he looked at his face in the mirror. Not badly marked this time, just a little swelling, a little redness, the kind of wear and tear he had come to think of as Norman. He asked himself quietly, in the privacy of his own head, whether he could see himself doing this 10 years from now. The answer came back as a soft, honest no. He untied his gloves with fingers that felt heavier than they should. When he stepped out into the corridor, the man in the dark suit was waiting, as if he had known exactly when the match would end. "How do you feel?" the man asked. "Tired," Chin said. "But clear." "Clear is good," the man replied. "Come take a ride. We will get coffee." In the car they drove through streets that Chin knew from childhood, but which looked slightly different from behind the glass of a clean sedan. "You did what you set out to do," the man said. "You proved you could stand in front of another man and not flinch. People respect that. Now there is other work where that kind of heart is needed. Work where you do not have to keep taking punches to earn your bread." Chin watched the passing storefronts, families coming out of late dinners, men in overcoats heading toward bars, women carrying bags of groceries. The city moved in layers, and he could feel himself shifting from one to another. "What kind of work?" he asked again, though he already knew the answer. The man smiled. "The family kind," he said simply. "Not the kind with your brothers and your parents, though we respect that too. The other family. The one that runs through this neighborhood like a hidden street. The one that has been watching you since you were a boy on Thompson." The word hung between them, heavy and light at the same time. Chin took a slow breath. "I will help where I can," he said. "Quiet work. Nothing flashy." "That is exactly what we need," the man replied. In the years that followed, people would remember that one of the strongest crime families in the city gained a new soldier around that time. A quiet one who never boasted, never shouted. But on that particular night, it was just a tired young man deciding that he was finished letting strangers hit him for a living. The next mornings in the gym were different. He still came by, still trained a little, but the tape on his hands grew looser. The trainers talked of future bouts, and he nodded without making promises. The men from the club began to drop by more often. They would stand in the doorway, watching him work on the bag or run lines across the ring. When he finished, they would gesture toward the street. "You ready?" they would ask. "We have something to move, someone to see." In time, the gym faded into the background of his days, then into memory. The back rooms grew larger. In those rooms, he learned the kind of lessons no trainer could teach. How to read the mood of a table by the way men held their cigarettes. How to sense when a deal was going sideways before anyone raised their voice. How to sit for hours, saying almost nothing, and still be in the center of the decision. The old watchmaker on Thompson Street might not have approved of the work his son had chosen, but he would have recognized the care with which Chin measured each moment, each silence, each glance. The boy who had once let other men set the pace in the ring was now learning to set the pace in rooms where the real fights were arranged. He was not the boss yet, not even close. He was a worker among many, another quiet pair of hands in a large, complicated machine. But people remembered his name. They started to use the English version more often. Vincent. It sat well on him, solid, unhurried. The sort of name you could write at the top of a file that would grow thicker with each passing year. Chapter 4. Messages for a Quiet Boss. On certain spring nights, the city feels almost gentle. The air softens, the lights look warmer, and for a little while people forget that underneath all the concrete and glass, there is always something hard and sharp waiting to be stepped on. It was such a night when Frank Costello rode the elevator up to his apartment. Uptown, far from Thompson Street, the streets were wide and well swept. The lobby of Costello's building smelled faintly of polished wood and old money. A polite doorman tipped his cap and pushed the button for the elevator, then stepped back with a respect that came from more than duts the rent the man upstairs paid. Frank Costello was a name that carried weight, not only in the papers, but in the smaller conversations that kept certain businesses alive. For years he had been a figure at the top of one of the city's biggest criminal organizations, a man who mixed suits and cigars with backroom understandings. On this particular evening he had left one of his regular midtown spots, a place where tables were always waiting, and the staff knew better than to listen too closely. The ride home had been uneventful. Perhaps he thought about meetings earlier in the day. Perhaps he thought about tomorrow's calls. Perhaps he tried not to think at all. He stepped into the elevator with the easy habit of a man who had done so thousands of times. The lift hummed upward, numbers glowing softly on a panel. When the doors slid open on his floor, the hallway yawned in front of him, long and polished, lined with framed prints that barely registered in his mind anymore. Somewhere else in the city, in a smaller room with lower ceilings, conversations had taken place about this very hallway. By that time, Vito Genovese was already pushing to reshape who held power and where. Certain people were obstacles, others were assets. Costello, who had once stood at the center of things, was considered by some to be in the way. Messages had to be sent. In that world, messages were rarely written down on paper. Vincent's name rose in those talks. He was not the only man considered for the task, but he was one of the few who combined two important qualities. He could be trusted to do what was asked, and he could be trusted not to speak about it afterward. In the social club on Sullivan Street, men sat at a table with coffee cups and card decks, speaking in the kind of calm, indirect language they preferred. "There is a situation that needs a firm reminder," one of them said. "The old man is not listening the way he used to," said another. "It may be time for someone to speak in a language he cannot ignore." Eyes turned toward Vincent. He did not jump to volunteer, that was not how things worked, but he did not look away either. Later, alone on a quiet walk, he considered what was being asked. In the old life in the ring, there had been rules. The bell rang, the referee stood in the middle, the crowd watched. Here, the rules were written in different ink, but there were still codes, still lines that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. At some point he gave his answer, not in dramatic words, but in the simple way he agreed to be in a certain place at a certain time. The hallway in Costello's building looked no different from 100 other hallways in uptown buildings. Thick carpet, soft lighting, the faint smell of expensive cleaning products. Costello stepped forward, briefcase in one hand, the long day heavy on his shoulders. What happened next has been described many times, each version shaped by who was telling it and what they wanted to underline. There was a figure waiting near the stairwell. There were a few quiet steps. Then there was a sudden, violent interruption in the calm night. We do not need to linger on the details. There was a sharp sound that echoed off the marble. There was a flash that did not come from the overhead lights. For a split second, the hallway stopped being a hallway and became a kind of border between the life Costello had been living and the life he would have to live afterward. The message did not land with the precision its authors had planned. Costello survived. Instead of falling and staying still, he staggered, struck at the top of his head. Pain and shock crashed over him, but he remained on his feet. A line of red appeared where none had been before, trickling down to stain his collar. The attack was clumsy in that narrow space. A warning meant to be final turned into something else, something messier. The would-be messenger retreated. A door opened. Voices rose. Someone shouted for help. The elevator doors, still open, watched silently. In the days that followed, the newspapers had more to say about it than Costello did. They described a powerful figure nearly unalived in his own building. They printed diagrams of the hallway, made neat lines where in reality there had been only chaos. They used big words like boss and underworld and vendetta. Detectives swarmed the building, tracing every footprint, questioning every employee. They wanted a story that would make sense on paper. Costello himself was more careful. When the time came to speak in a courtroom, he did something that surprised some people and disappointed others. Standing at the witness stand, the faint mark of the wound still part of his features, he kept his eyes steady and his words calm. He was asked whether he could identify the man who had attacked him in that hallway. He said that he could not. Maybe it was the shock of the night lingering in his mind. Maybe the figure had indeed been just a blur in his memory. Or maybe he weighed another kind of cost, one not easily measured by police forms. Whatever his reasons, the result was the same. In the courtroom, another man sat at the defense table, listening as the one person who could have pointed a finger chose not to do so. That man's name was Vincent Gigante. The trial moved forward and then sagged. Without solid identification, the case against Vincent weakened. Lawyers in suits argued over evidence, jurors watched faces instead of facts. In the end, Vincent was acquitted. On paper, that was the official record, acquittal. In the smaller circles where his world actually turned, a different kind of record was kept. He had carried out a message for people far above him in the structure. It had not gone exactly as planned, but the important part was that he had taken the risk, and then held his silence when it mattered. Costello, by choosing not to identify him, had made a decision of his own. Some said it was an act of old-fashioned honor. Others thought it was simple self-preservation, a refusal to name a man who stood so close to figures with long memories. Either way, Vincent walked out of the courtroom a free man. He did not celebrate loudly. There were no toasts in public, no visible relief. That was not his style. Instead, he slipped back into the quieter rooms where more important evaluations were being made. In a back office of the social club, Vito Genovese studied him with calm interest. "You did what was asked," Genovese said. "The situation was not perfect, but you stood up. And you kept your mouth closed when others would have tried to talk themselves clever." Vincent nodded once. "Things did not go as clean as I wanted," he said. "The hallway was narrow. Timing was off." Genovese waved away the explanation. "The past is the past," he said. "What matters is that you showed your heart. We do not forget such things." He did not need to say that there would be other tasks, other nights, other moments when courage and silence would be required. That was understood. In the neighborhood, word spread in the usual sideways way. People said that Chin had been involved in something big uptown. They said his name was mentioned in the same breath as Costello's. They said he had walked out of court smiling. The truth, as always, was more complicated. He walked out of court in a suit that fit a little better than his earlier ones, but still did not announce itself. His expression was as unreadable as ever. Inside, he understood that his life had tilted again. There is a difference between running envelopes and carrying a message that might change who sits at the top of a criminal family. By being trusted with such a task, he had stepped onto a narrower path, one where mistakes had a shorter forgiveness. For the watchmaker's son from Thompson Street, the hallway in that uptown building was more than just a place on a map. It was a line between the boy who once threw jabs for small crowds and the man who now moved in the heart of something much larger. In years to come, when federal agents sat in cars on Sullivan Street and watched an old man in a bathrobe shuffle past, they would flip through thick files that mentioned, in tight official language, the attack on Frank Costello. They would underline dates and whisper about motives. What they could not fully capture in those pages was the quiet inner calculation of the young man who had walked away from that hallway and chosen to keep moving deeper into the world that had sent him there. Acquittal had kept him out of prison, but in another sense it had bound him more tightly to the family whose trust he had earned. He had proved himself willing to deliver messages. In time, the city would learn that he was just as skilled at sending them without ever raising his voice. Chapter 5. The Apprentice of Genovese. The first time Vincent walked through the gates of a federal prison, the sky above him looked strangely small. The walls rose on either side like tired cliffs. The air smelled of metal and laundry soap and something older that could not be washed out. Men moved in slow patterns across the yard, each carrying his own invisible weight. Vincent was not alone. Vito Genovese walked beside him, shorter but heavier, a man whose reputation entered a room before he did. To the guards he was another inmate. To many of the men already inside he was something closer to royalty in a kingdom no one admitted existed. They had been taken down together in a narcotics case that wound through courtrooms and tangled testimony. For prosecutors it was a prize. For the family it was an annoyance, not a collapse. The machine would keep running on the outside. Still, for Vincent it was a new chapter. Prison is a harsh word, but inside, the days often felt dull rather than dramatic. Mornings began with the same bell, the same shuffling line to the same cafeteria. The food was grey and forgettable, designed more to fill than to satisfy. Men guarded their seats at tables the way they once guarded street corners. To an outside eye it was all grim routine. To someone like Vincent it was something else as well. It was a classroom. He watched Vito move through that place with calm command. The older man never raised his voice. He did not need to. A nod was enough. A glance across the yard carried more meaning than some men could pack into an angry speech. When they walked the track in slow circles, Vito spoke about the world beyond the fence, not in grand speeches but in small practical lessons. He would describe a union local as if it were a family tree, tracing who owed loyalty to whom, which businesses listened when certain names were mentioned. He talked about judges and politicians the way other men talked about distant cousins. Some were reliable, some were not, and all of them could be understood if you paid attention. Vincent listened. The days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. On paper, 7 of them. Inside the walls they measured time in seasons. The yard turned brown, then green, then brown again. New men arrived with nervous faces. Older ones left, their hair thinner and their eyes more careful. In the evenings, card games spread across the common rooms. Men sat at metal tables, dealing worn decks, trading small notes of currency and large stories from outside. Laughter rose at odd moments, sharp and brief. It surprised visitors to hear it echoing off concrete. Vincent played sometimes, but more often he watched. He learned who could not stand to lose even a small pot. He noticed which men lied about trivial things and which ones admitted their mistakes. These details mattered in a world where trust was often all you had to trade. Vito used those hours as well. He would lean back in his chair, hands light on the cards, and ask questions that sounded casual. "How is your cousin doing in the trucking company? You still got that brother in the housing authority? Your sister married that guy who works in the union office, right?" The men answered eagerly. To them it was a chance to be heard, to feel connected to a wider world. To Vito it was information. Vincent drank it in. He saw how a network could be maintained even inside a place designed to cut men off from their connections. The family was not a building or a table in a club. It was a web of favours, loyalties, fears and hopes that stretched from this yard to back rooms all over the city. At night, in his bunk, Vincent lay awake listening to the soft murmurs of the tier. Men talked in their sleep, made noises of regret or defiance. Somewhere a radio played a faint song from a station that barely reached this far. He thought of Thompson Street, of his mother at the window, of his father bending over a watch, of Louis kneeling in a quiet chapel. He thought of the hallway uptown and of the silence in the courtroom that had followed. He did not spend much time on guilt. That was not how he was built, but he did think often about preparation. If he ever got out, he told himself he would not come back in, not through carelessness, not through talking too much. If there had to be risk, it would be measured. When parole finally came, it did not arrive like a sudden freedom. It came in a slow series of meetings, forms, signatures. The day the gate opened for him, the sky looked large again and yet somehow thinner, as if the world outside had been worn down while he was away. Vito walked out before him. The older man had already set pieces moving for his return to power. For Vincent, there was no immediate throne to climb onto. There was only work. The family had not forgotten him. He returned to the Triangle Civic Improvement Association, the club that pretended to be nothing more than a community group. The chairs were in the same places, the coffee cups were the same chipped ceramic, the television in the corner had changed, but the faces around the tables had not changed as much as time should have allowed. Men greeted him warmly. "You look good," they said. "Prison has not softened you." He smiled a little, polite and closed. Prison had not softened him. It had given him something else instead. It had given him patience sharpened into a tool. He was given a crew to run. The Greenwich Village crew, a phrase that sounded almost charming until you looked at the ledger behind it. They had interests in the waterfront, in construction, in unions, in illegal games that everyone pretended not to notice. From a small office in the back of the club, Vincent sent men out to handle these interests. He did not shout, he did not pound tables. He spoke quietly, assigned tasks, asked for updates, and remembered every detail. If a man told him that a certain business owner was late on his payments because a child was sick, Vincent would nod and offer another week. But he would also remember the name of the child, the nature of the illness, the exact date of the extension. The next time he saw that man, he would ask how the child was doing. It was a kindness and a reminder. The social club itself was a stage where different plays unfolded at once. At one table, old men spent hours over chessboards, arguing about moves and the weather. At another, a group of younger men watched sports and commented on players as if nothing else in the world mattered. In the kitchen, someone always seemed to be stirring a pot of sauce, the smell drifting through the rooms like a promise of another life. Behind all that, envelopes changed hands. Phone calls went out. Schedules shifted to make room for quiet meetings. The place was both a neighborhood living room and a control room. Even matters that looked local could reach surprisingly far. Across the river in New Jersey, a small town called Old Tappan learned that lesson. There, local officers found themselves courted, then pressured, then quietly bribed by men tied to the crew. The goal was simple enough for that world. If the police turned their heads at the right times, certain operations could flow more smoothly. When investigators eventually followed the trail back, Vincent's name appeared again. This time, though, the response was different. Instead of a straightforward legal defense, there was talk of doctors and reports. Files began to mention words like delusions and unfit for trial. Vincent checked into hospitals as eagerly as some men checked into hotels. He shuffled through corridors, avoided direct question, spoke of voices and confusion. Some of it perhaps had seeds in reality. Long years of tension, of guarded living, of constant calculation could bend a mind. But the timing was not lost on anyone paying attention. In court, lawyers argued that he did not understand the charges. They pointed to stacks of medical evaluations, to testimony from psychiatrists who had spent hours in rooms with him as he stared at the wall and muttered about things that did not quite add up. Judges paused, reread the reports, and hesitated. The system does not like to move forward when a defendant seems truly broken. It prefers clear villains, or at least clear stories. A man who might not grasp what was happening unsettled the careful rituals of justice. Cases stalled, delays piled up. Outside the courthouse, in the quiet offices of the social club, Vincent sat at a table and went over numbers with his crew. If he felt any cracks inside, he kept them to himself. Men who visited him at home saw two sides. On some days he seemed vague, drifting through rooms in a bathrobe, talking to himself. On others, he could sit down with a ledger and point out exactly where a shipment had been miscounted or where a loan had gone unpaid for 1 week too long. To his close associates, the lesson was clear. The confusion could be turned on and off. This was the beginning of the long game that would later make federal agents sit in cars on Sullivan Street, wondering whether the man they watched was truly damaged, or simply the best actor the city had produced in decades. For now, it was just one more line in a growing file. Doctors wrote their notes, prosecutors clenched their teeth, judges signed orders, not competent to stand trial, remanded to care, released. Back in the neighborhood, the clocks kept ticking. The watchmaker had long since passed on, his tools perhaps tucked in a drawer somewhere, but his middle son carried the sense of time inside him. He knew when to appear strong and when to appear weak, when to be the man at the head of the table, and when to be the shuffling figure in a hospital gown. From the outside, it might have looked like confusion. From the inside, it was apprenticeship on a different level. Not up under Vito Genovese now, but under the whole strange system they had built together. The boy from Thompson Street had become a captain. Soon, without any public ceremony, he would become something more. Chapter 6: 2 Households and a Kingdom. If you followed Vincent's days on a map, the lines would look like a quiet storm. They would begin in the suburbs, sweep into the city, curl around a few blocks of Greenwich Village, then rise uptown and slip back across the river. Over and over, the same routes traced with small variations, like a man pacing inside an enormous invisible room. In Old Tappan, New Jersey, mornings began softly. The house there was set back from the road with a lawn that tried its best against the seasons. Trees stood like patient guards around the property, their branches changing colour and shape as the year turned. Inside, the air carried the smell of coffee and toast, and the faint floral touch of cleaning products chosen with care. Olympia Gripper moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast for the children and for the husband, who seemed always half present, half elsewhere. To neighbours, they looked like any other family that had managed to climb a few rungs up from the city tenements. The car in the driveway was modest but clean. The kids went to school in clothes that did not shout but did not embarrass either. On weekends there might be a barbecue, a birthday party, a gathering where laughter rose over the clipped grass. Vincent, in this setting, was quiet but gentle. He asked about homework, about friends, about which teacher was giving too much work. He listened to small complaints about cafeteria food as if they were reports on important negotiations. He was often away, but when he was home he tried to fit the role. He fixed a loose cabinet door. He stood under the hood of the car with a neighbour, nodding along to talk about spark plugs even if his mind was on shipping schedules at the docks. Some mornings, after seeing the children off to school, he would stand on the porch with a cup of coffee and stare at the trees. The quiet there had a different texture than the quiet of the city. It was thicker, more complete. No sirens in the distance, no shouting from a corner, just birds and the occasional hum of a passing car. Then he would put the cup down, pick up his keys, and step back into the other life. The drive into Manhattan was its own kind of bridge between worlds. Traffic on the highways, toll booths, the sudden crush of buildings as he crossed the river. The skyline rose ahead like an old friend with a complicated history. On the Upper East Side, another household waited. The apartment there was neater, more contained. The streets outside were cleaner but somehow harsher. Money lived there in a more obvious way, in the shine of storefronts and the quiet confidence of doormen. Inside, Olympia Esposito kept a different kind of home. There were children here as well, laughter in the hallways, arguments over television, the usual small dramas of family life. The neighbors knew Vincent as the man who came and went at odd hours, always polite, never overly familiar. He did not advertise the connection between this place and the house in Old Tappan. The two Olympias moved in mostly separate orbits, held apart not only by roads and rivers but by unspoken agreements. To outsiders, this might have looked like a tangle of lies. To Vincent, it was logistics. The city was full of men who kept different versions of themselves in different neighborhoods. He just had more reason than most to keep the lines from crossing. Between those two homes ran the constant thread of his real work. In Greenwich Village, the Triangle Civic Improvement Association still hummed along, a second living room where the city dropped its more polite mask. Vincent arrived late in the afternoons like a doctor making his rounds. He would move from table to table, greeting men by name, asking about their families before asking about their collections or their deliveries. Reports came in from the waterfront, from the markets, from union offices. A driver might mention a new face hanging around the docks. A bookmaker might complain that a small crew from another family was testing the edges of their territory. A union delegate might quietly say that a certain contractor was late on an agreed payment. Vincent listened, sorted, decided. Some matters could be resolved with a phone call. Others needed a sit-down, one of those meetings in back rooms where chairs were placed with careful spacing and coffee cups served as blunt punctuation marks. A few required more creative solutions, the kind that reminded people why it was better to keep agreements than to test them. Through all of it, he kept his voice low. By this time, another figure had taken on a visible role in the family. Anthony Salerno, the man everyone called Fat Tony, sat at the head of tables in public settings, taking the heat that came with visibility. Investigator and reporters alike pointed their cameras and microphones toward him. He was the one seen exiting clubs, the one whose name appeared in headlines. Behind that curtain, another man's influence grew. Philip Lombardo, older and careful, had already begun to pull back, his health and age steering him toward a quieter corner. In that space, Vincent stepped forward, not as a public face, but as a guiding hand. When law enforcement listened to wiretaps and watched comings and goings, they often fixed on Salerno. To them, he looked like the boss, sitting in his favorite chairs, surrounded by men who treated him as such. Inside the family, whispers told a different story. Men spoke of Vincent as the real power, the one who decided which deals to bless and which to block, the one who could approve an action or freeze it with a single quiet comment. Salerno might shout and joke and play cards at the front of the stage. Vincent directed the lighting from the wings. This suited him. He had no interest in speeches or public displays. He preferred small rooms where everyone present understood the stakes and nobody took notes on paper. From his seat at the club, he coordinated the various crews as if he were adjusting tiny gears in some enormous watch. A phone call from a union contact would set a meeting in motion. A word from a construction boss would reset the price of concrete at a city project. A brief report from a man at the fish market might lead to a shift in which suppliers were welcome and which would find their trucks waiting longer at the docks. His calm style travelled back up the chain. If a younger man came in angry about a slight, demanding swift and dramatic action, Vincent would listen, let the fire burn itself down, and then explain the costs. If we rush, he would say, they will rush too. Then everyone pays. We do not like to pay. His sentences were simple, but the math behind them was complicated. He had seen, in prison yards and in courtrooms, what happened to people who let their tempers outrun their planning. He had no intention of joining them again. At home, in Old Tappan, this side of him rarely showed. The children saw a father who sometimes nodded off in front of the television, who sometimes stared a little too long out the window, lost in thought. On certain days he seemed scattered, misplacing objects, forgetting stories halfway through. He did not entirely mind if they thought of him as distracted. It fit a different script, one that would become more important as the years went on. In the city apartment he allowed himself a little more sharpness. The pace of life there demanded it. Still, even in the Upper East Side rooms, he sometimes let his shoulders droop, his speech wander, as if he were rehearsing another version of himself. Between these domestic places, between the club and the union halls and the markets, his reputation grew. Men came to him with dilemmas that did not have obvious answers. A crew in the Bronx wanted more territory. A gambling spot in Queens was drawing police attention. A long-time associate in Brooklyn had fallen ill and left a hole in a delicate arrangement. Vincent would listen, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. Then he would offer a path that minimized damage and maximized long-term control. As years passed, the understand became fixed. Lombardo was elder statesman, Salerno was the visible boss, the man on the posters in law enforcement offices. Vincent was the quiet center. Agents did not entirely miss this. Some of them muttered that the Bathrobe act in the village was just that, an act. They swapped stories of sightings at high-level meetings where he wore sharp suits and spoke with total clarity about shipping schedules and union votes. But in official papers confusion reigned. One document would list Salerno as boss, another would name Lombardo. Rumors in memos would claim that Vincent was just a semi-retired figure, too unwell to be more than a symbol. This knot of competing narratives pleased him. The more the outside world argued over who really made the decisions, the more room he had to make them. At night, when the day's routes were done, he might find himself once more on the porch in Old Tappan, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of a highway. In those moments he was both less and more than the legends that would later swirl around his name. He was a man who had built a life across multiple fronts and somehow kept them all standing. A wife in the suburbs who wanted stability, a companion in the city who wanted presence, children who wanted a father, associates who wanted strong guidance, superiors who wanted loyalty without question, and, increasingly, rivals and investigators who wanted an explanation that made sense. He gave each of them just enough, never the whole. Years later, when people shook their heads at the story of the odd father wandering the streets in a robe, the quieter truth lay here in these years of constant movement between houses and offices. Before the bathrobe, there was the suit. Before the muttering on Sullivan Street, there were clear commands given over coffee. Before the performance of madness, there was the very precise sanity of a man who knew exactly where he stood in the invisible kingdom he helped run. Chapter 7. The Bathrobe Defense. In the mornings, the hospital smelled of disinfectant and muted hope. Vincent learned the hallways the way other men learn neighborhoods. Long corridors lined with doors, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the soft clink of medication carts, the murmur of televisions left on for company more than entertainment. He checked into clinics so often that some staff began to recognize him. There was the private hospital uptown with polished floors and quiet rooms, the state facility further out where the walls carried more echoes, the small psychiatric wards attached to general hospitals where troubled minds were just one department among many. On paper, he was a patient. In the eyes of the people who ran his world, he was rehearsing. The routine settled into something almost graceful. An investigation would heat up. His name would start appearing more often in reports and whispers. A case in New Jersey, a subpoena in New York, a new push by a young prosecutor eager to make a name. Then Vincent would appear at a hospital reception desk, shoulders slumped, eyes distant. He spoke in a mumbling drift. Headaches, he would mention. Confusion. Strange thoughts. Dreams that felt more real than waking. He would tell them about voices, about shadows, about fears that did not quite add up. Doctors, trained to take such complaints seriously, opened files. They scheduled consultations. They asked questions. They ran tests that measured brain waves and blood levels, reflexes and reactions. They wrote down every odd answer he gave. Sometimes he would sit in a chair, hands in his lap, and simply stare at a fixed point on the wall, If someone asked him a direct question, he would answer indirectly, circling around the subject like a man who had lost his way in his own head. Other times, when no one with a white coat was watching, he seemed sharper. A nurse might glance into his room and see him playing cards with a visitor, the game moving at a brisk, confident pace. A family member might find him discussing a news headline with clear, organized thoughts, only to watch him fall back into vagueness when a doctor entered. There were genuine cracks, of course. No one can live as he did without collecting fractures in the mind. Years of divided attention, of hiding parts of himself in different rooms, of measuring every word for risk and reward, all of that leaves marks. But those cracks became tools. Lawyers gathered the medical reports, stacking them neatly. Each new evaluation added another layer to the portrait. Chronic delusions, disorganized thinking, questionable grasp of reality. The words did not match the man who sat at the head of tables in the social club, but they started to match the man federal agents saw shuffling down Sullivan Street in a bathrobe. The performances on the street began slowly at first. One evening, instead of leaving his building in a suit, Vincent stepped out in a faded bathrobe. The fabric hung loose around him, cinched with a belt that looked as tired as he did. On his feet, soft slippers that made barely any sound on the concrete. He walked with a hesitant gait, as if every step surprised him. Neighbours noticed. At first they thought it was a one-time oddity. Maybe he had forgotten something. Maybe he was sick. Maybe age had finally bent him. Then he did it again, and again. Some nights he wandered the block, muttering to himself in a jumble of English and Italian, words spilling out in tangled threads. He spoke to parking meters and to lampposts, to parked cars, to the empty air. He would stop, head tilted, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then he would answer in a low voice, hands gesturing weakly. Children watched from windows, faces pressed to glass. "Who is that?" they asked. Parents gave different answer. "He is sick," some said. "Have some respect." "He is nobody," others said, pulling their kids away, though their eyes stayed on the figure in the robe. In the deli on the corner, the owner put down his knife and leaned on the counter to watch Vincent pass. "That is the boss," he whispered to a regular. "Or he used to be. Now he just walks and talks to himself." The regular frowned. "Maybe that is the disguise," he said. The owner shrugged. "Maybe," he answered. "Or maybe years in that world scramble your brains like eggs. Either way, it is not my business." Upstairs, an old woman whose memory held more years than most of the city heard the soft shuffle outside and went to her window. "It is him again," she told herself. "The boy from the neighborhood. The one who used to stand so straight. Look at him now." Yet she watched every time, unable to look away from the sad, slow spectacle. For the agents in the unmarked cars, the act was both frustrating and fascinating. They had listened to wiretaps where Vincent sounded perfectly lucid. Calm, precise conversations about shipments and unions. Clear references to men by name and by nickname. An understand of the city's invisible map that no confused mind could manage. And yet here he was, moving through the village like a sleepwalker, muttering to trash cans. In the car, an agent flipped through the photographs spread across the front seat. In Nen, Vincent sat at a restaurant table with other known figures, leaning in, hands folded, eyes alert. In another, taken just days later, he stood in a hospital gown beside a doctor, mouth slightly open, gaze unfocused. In a third, he shuffled along Sullivan Street in his robe, head down, hair uncombed. It was like looking at three different men. They argued about it at the office. Some said he was truly broken. All that stress, an agent insisted, all those years of watching his back, it gets to you. The brain is not made for that kind of constant pressure. Others were not so sure. "He has played the longest game we have ever seen," another agent muttered. "Every time we get close to a trial, he checks into a hospital. Every time a grand jury hears his name, there is another stack of psychiatric reports. And all the while, the money keeps moving." The supervisors read the reports and frowned. In court, prosecutors tried to push cases forward. They called expert witnesses who insisted that men could pretend to be more ill than they were. They presented surveillance tapes that showed Vincent on days when the robe was hanging on a hook and the walk straightened, the voice firm. Defense lawyers countered with doctors who testified that mental illness could wax and wane, that patients could have moments of clarity amid confusion, that hospital records told a consistent story of a man whose mind did not function in a linear way. Judges sat between these two narratives, feeling the weight of each. On bad days for the government, the gavel came down in favor of more tests, more evaluations, more delays. The defendant, they wrote, may not be competent to stand trial at this time. Each such decision bought Vincent another stretch of time in the half-world he had constructed. Officially a patient, unofficially a boss. At home, the performance took a toll. His family saw more of the shambling figure, less of the precise man. It was hard to tell where the act ended and the real changes of age began. Some nights he sat in his chair and stared at the television without really watching. A son would speak to him and receive a vague answer, unrelated to the question. A daughter would try to remind him of a story from years past, only to see his face cloud with effort. Other nights, when visitors from the old life came by, he seemed to sharpen. The talk turned to legal troubles, to family matters, to shifting alliances. His language grew more exact, his sentences lined up. The old authority crept back into his posture. Then, as if a director had called cut, he would slump again, covering his eyes with one hand, complaining softly about headaches, about fog, about the feeling that his mind was slipping away. For those close to him, it was both frightening and strangely practical. They saw that he was using his own instability as a kind of shield. Yet they also saw that real age and real strain were at work. The performance may have started as a strategy. Over time, pieces of it settled into him until they were part of who he was. In the village, the bathrobe walks became a familiar feature of the night. Couples heading home from late dinners would pause as he passed, their conversations interrupted by the sight of this shambling figure with the heavy reputation. Artists in garret apartments sketched his outline on scraps of paper, capturing the dip of his shoulders, the way his slippers seemed too soft for the rough sidewalk. Musicians walking their instruments home from a gig would nod to him, an odd little respect between people who worked in the late hours. The city folded the odd father into its collection of characters, a living legend who had somehow become a local ghost before he was even gone. In the cars, the agents took turns on watch. Some of them grew almost fond of the routine. They knew when he would likely emerge, which corners he favoured, which stops he made. They came to recognise the neighbours by silhouette. They learned the patterns of which windows lit dope at what times. Yet underneath that strange, cosy familiarity, tension remained. They knew that behind those slow, distracted walks lay one of the most powerful criminal organisations in the country. They knew that somewhere in that shuffling figure's history were decisions that had reshaped unions, businesses, lives. It was like watching a storm cloud that chose to look like cotton. On certain nights, as Vincent shuffled back toward his building, the younger agents could not help themselves. They imagined stepping out of the car, walking up to him, and saying in simple words, "We know you are not as lost as you pretend." But they stayed in the car. They stuck to their roles. The game had its own rules. He played his part, they played theirs. For every day he walked in the robe, lawyers prepared for the next case they hoped would finally pierce the act. For every legal petition they filed, another doctor wrote another evaluation that added fresh fog to the picture. Through it all, the windows of public housing towers across the city were filled and refilled with new glass. Contracts were signed, union meetings were held, money flowed through hidden channels. The bathrobe defense, as some came to call it in private, was not just about avoiding court. It was about buying time for a larger machine to keep running. Time, for Vincent, had always been the crucial element. Now he was bending it, stretching it, slowing it where he could. In old photographs, the boy from Thompson Street stared out with serious eyes. In more recent ones, the man in the bathrobe looked past the camera as if he no longer understood why anyone would take his picture. Between those two images lay a life of careful calculations. On Sullivan Street, as he reached his doorway after another slow circuit, he paused, hand on the frame. For a heartbeat, his posture straightened. His shoulders lifted. The old strength showed through. Then he hunched again, stepped inside, and closed the door. Chapter 8. Windows on the City. From certain heights, New York looks like a forest of windows. Tall towers and brick projects, walk-up tenements and new glass buildings, all of them glittering with squares of light. People live, work, argue and dream behind those panes, talking on phones, stirring pots, writing letters, staring at screens. For the city, windows were a matter of safety and comfort. For men like Vincent, they were also a matter of business. By the closing years of the 1970s, a quiet arrangement had taken shape among several of the city's crime families. It did not look like movies. There were no smoky gatherings where everyone banged on tables and shook fists. Instead, there were calm meetings in small rooms and long phone calls layered with polite words. The city's housing authority needed its buildings maintained. That meant contracts for installing and replacing thousands of windows in public housing complexes across the boroughs. The sums involved were large enough to catch serious attention. The work was steady. The rules about bidding, on paper, were strict. On another set of papers in other offices, a different set of rules developed. The families understood that if they fought openly over these contracts, they would draw the wrong kind of heat. Too much noise would bring investigators crashing through the arrangements, so they did something that looked, from the outside, almost cooperative. They agreed to share. Representatives of several families met to divide the pie. The Gambino organization would take certain pieces. The Lucchese people would handle others. The Colombo and Bonanno groups got their shares. The Genovese crew, with Vincent in a central role, carved out a large portion, especially in areas where their influence was already rooted. On paper, legitimate companies bid for the contracts. Their names were listed in neat columns in city offices. Their glossy brochures touted years of experience and quality workmanship. But in the back rooms, the owners of these companies sat with men from the families going over numbers in a different way. They all understood the script. "This time, your company bids low," one of the men would explain. "Another company will bid higher. You will win. On the next job, you sit back. Put in a number that looks respectable but not competitive. Let the other own win. At the end of the month, we settle up so everyone gets their taste. Bid rigging, the prosecutors would call it later. To the men involved, it was simply making sure that nobody got greedy enough to upset the balance. In the middle of this web sat the Genovese structure. From the Triangle Civic Improvement Association and from other quiet addresses, calls went out. Meetings were scheduled in diners, in back offices, in private rooms above restaurants, where the napkins were thick and the music stayed low. Businessmen who had once seen themselves as independent soon understood that the cost of real independence was high. Better to be part of the program, as the phrase went. Bid when asked, stand down when asked, do the work on time, hand over the agreed portion afterward. In exchange, they received fewer surprises, no trucks mysteriously vandalized overnight, no sudden labor problems on their job sites, no unexpected delays in permit approvals. Peace, of a sort, had its price. At union halls, men with modest titles and significant behind-the-scenes influence played their roles. At a folding table, a union officer talked about safety standards and overtime rules. In a private conversation later, the same man took a phone call that adjusted which company's crews would be recommended for a certain project. The rank-and-file workers mostly wanted steady pay and decent conditions. They did not always know, or want to know, how the list of winning companies was shaped before they ever picked up a hammer. Vincent handled his part of this with the same calm he brought to everything else. He did not sit in city offices or sign the public contracts. He did not appear at ribbon cuttings for renovated buildings. His name did not appear on any invoice. Instead, he received reports. A lieutenant would come to the club and say that a certain contract had been awarded as planned. Another would mention that a company had gotten ideas about bidding on a project without checking with the right people. Vincent would nod, make a note in his head, and decide whether the situation needed a gentle reminder or a firmer correction. He thought of windows in practical terms. Each one was a small unit of money. Add enough of them together, and you had streams of cash flowing quietly through bank accounts and envelopes. Those streams fed into a larger river that sustained the family's operations: loans, gambling, payouts to jailed members, support for families of men who had taken charges and kept their mouths closed. In public housing towers from the Bronx to Brooklyn, residents noticed that work crews came and went with regularity. Some tenants complained that the new windows stuck in summer or let in drafts in winter. Others were just glad to have something that closed properly at all. They did not see the hidden meetings that decided which company's logo appeared on the side of the truck parked outside their building. As the 1980s unfolded, law enforcement's attention sharpened. Young investigators joined units dedicated to organized crime, bringing with them fresh energy and thinner patience for the old legends. They pored over records, looking for patterns in the bids. They saw that time and again the same companies appeared at the top of the lists. They saw rivals submitting higher bids that seemed curiously non-competitive. They saw that losing bidders kept coming back even after losing repeatedly. It did not look like genuine competition. They requested more record. They mapped out which companies were based where, who their officers were, who their silent partners might be. They began to cross-reference those names with known associates of the famines. The lines on those charts led again and again toward the same nodes: union officials with recorded mob ties, contractors who had been seen at certain clubs, bank accounts that showed unusual patterns of deposits and withdrawals. In brightly lit government offices, far from the dim corners of the social clubs, task forces met to discuss what they were finding. They spoke about enterprise corruption, about the need to see the families as businesses rather than loose gatherings of tough men. They talked about following the money instead of chasing the street-level activity. The housing authority's window contracts were a perfect case study. Vincent read the same newspapers as everyone else, though he paid more attention to the parts that most readers skipped. When articles began to hint at investigations into contract irregularities, he did not panic. He had been around long enough to know that not every probe ended in charges. Still, he adjusted. Instructions went out to be more careful. Phone calls that would once have travelled over lines known to be tapped shifted to in-person conversations. Men were told to take longer routes to meetings, to vary their routines. Some companies, sensing danger, tried to inch away from the arrangement. Pulling back was not simple. They had spent years benefiting from bids tilted in their favour. They had grown used to making business plans based on the assumption that certain contracts would land in their laps. When a few tried to take their chances alone, suddenly their trucks had more trouble on the roads. Permits got delayed. New inspection issues popped up on their sites. No one ever came out and said, "You are being punished." That was not the style. But the message came through. In the club, Vincent weighed the risks. He knew that the older model where families carved up neighborhoods with explicit threats and open displays of power was fading. The new world demanded more subtlety. But subtlety did not mean absence. It meant playing several moves ahead. As law enforcement built more sophisticated cases, they began to see him less as a rumor and more as a central figure. Wiretaps from other families mentioned him by name as someone who sat on commission meetings, helping settle disputes and coordinate operations. Turncoats from rival crews spoke about how no major decision in certain sectors was made without at least a nod from the quiet man tied to the Genovese family. They knew that even if he did not sign contracts, his influence shaped who could bid and who could not. Federal agents and city investigators worked together to bring these threads into a single case. They gathered witnesses. A contractor, worn down by years of payments and the constant fear of being caught in the middle, agreed to talk. A union officer, facing his own charges, decided that his best path forward lay in cooperation. From another family, a high-ranking member turned informant and described commission meetings where the window business and other rackets were discussed in calm voices, as if the men were simply managing a company's divisions. In transcripts, Vincent's name appeared amid talk of percentages and territories. Prosecutors drafted an indictment that read less like a simple accusation and more like a diagnosis of a long illness in the city's systems: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, control of union and city contracts. For each charge, they tried to anchor the allegations in stories jurors could understand. Here is a landlord who paid too much for repairs because bids were fixed. Here is a worker whose job depended on union cards controlled by men in back rooms. Here is a taxpayer whose money flowed not only to public housing, but to the pockets of organised crime figures overseeing the process. When Vincent and several associates were finally brought into court on these broader enterprise charges, the spotlight landed on him again. This time, the picture prosecutors painted was not of a single hallway in an uptown building or a local police department in New Jersey. It was of a man whose influence touched construction sites, union offices, fish markets, trucking firms, and city agencies. The defense replied with the now familiar image of a confused, damaged mind. They brought back the doctor. They presented years of hospital records, pages of reported delusions, stories of bathrobe walks and muttering in the street. They showed that, at times, he had seemed unable to manage basic tasks, let alone orchestrate an elaborate contracting scheme. In quiet rooms away from the courtroom, investigators rubbed tired eyes and stared at their own charts. They had built a picture of the window racket, of the unions, of the meetings. They believed in the pattern they saw, but they had to fit that pattern into a system that hesitated to punish someone who might not fully understand what was happening. The legal battles stretched on. The city's housing projects continued to receive new panes of glass. Residents opened and closed them against the weather. Children pressed their hands against them on rainy days, watching the water run down outside. At night, lights glowed behind them like small, contained stars. To most of the people behind those windows, the story of who had controlled the contracts was distant, an abstract matter for newspapers and politicians. To Vincent, it was another demonstration of how deeply the families could weave themselves into the city's everyday life without most people noticing. It was also a sign that the era of quiet arrangements was changing. The same task forces that dug into the window contracts were also building cases on other fronts. They were listening more, watching more, learning the rhythms of the organizations the way a young fighter once learned the rhythm of an opponent in the ring. The long game of the bathrobe defense could slow some cases, muddy others, but it could not stop everything forever. In the club, as news of fresh indictments and new cooperators reached him, Vincent's already narrow eyes narrowed further. The city had always been a forest of windows. Now, more of those panes were turning into mirrors, reflecting back the hidden deals that had shaped them. He had guided his kingdom through decades of growth and quiet profit. The walls around that kingdom were beginning to close in. Chapter 9. Trials, Verdicts, and the Unmasking. By the time the big cases reached the courtroom, the city had changed its soundtrack. Disco had come and gone, punk had snarled and faded. New styles rose from boomboxes and club speakers. Towers that were once symbols of one era gave way to scaffolding for the next. But some names refused to leave the stage. Vincent Gigante was one of them. On the bulletin boards inside federal offices, his photograph had aged. The early shots showed a strong jaw and watchful eyes. Later ones caught him mid-shuffle in a robe or slumped in a chair, mouth slightly open. Agents pinned these images up like pieces of a puzzle that would not quite fit together. The window cases and union cases and other enterprise charges had taken shape over years. The near-eyed lively. Investigator had followed phone calls, traced money, flipped minor figures who were tired of standing alone when the tide turned. They had something else now as well. Voices from the inside. It was one thing to suspect that commission meetings among the families existed. It was another thing to have a man who had sat at those tables describe them in his own careful words. Sammy Gravano, the underboss from a rival organization, had decided that the weight of his own charges was too much to carry alone. When he spoke to prosecutors, he did not stop at tales of his own family. He talked about the larger structure, the way the heads of several groups met to coordinate violence, profits, and peace. He painted a picture of gatherings where serious men with famous names discussed extortion, union infiltration, business control, and who was allowed to act against whom. It was a board meeting for a company that never filed public reports. In those accounts, the name Vincent appeared not as a ghost, but as a participant. Gravano said that the supposed madman in the bathrobe had arrived at meetings in clean suits, sat upright, spoke clearly, and understood every detail of the business at hand. He was not alone in saying so. Other cooperators, from other families and from within the Genovese world itself, described similar scenes. They spoke of Vincent asking precise questions about numbers and territories, of his ability to calm tempers and settle disputes, of his refusal to tolerate careless talk. Prosecutors gathered these statements and filed them along with documents and tapes. Each new piece pushed against the image that had been presented for years in hospital corridors and psychiatric reports. Still, the defense was not empty-handed. They brought their own witnesses to the stand. Doctors with serious faces and impressive titles testified about decades of symptoms. They spoke of hospitalizations, of reported auditory hallucinations, of cognitive tests where Vincent had given answers so confused that they seemed almost like parodies of rational thought. They described a man who could not correctly count backward by simple steps, a man who, when asked about the date, had given answers that belonged to another decade, a man who, asked to explain a proverb, had stared blankly as if the words were in some foreign language. The courtroom became a place where two realities fought for space. On one side, the government described a calculating figure at the center of a criminal enterprise. On the other, the defense showed a shuffling old man whose mind appeared tattered. Journalists filled the benches, scribbling notes. Their readers would later see sketches of Vincent at the defense table, head bowed, eyes lowered, sometimes seeming to doze. They would read phrases like alleged boss and reputed head and long-time leader. They would also read descriptions of him being wheeled in and out of the courtroom, of whispered conferences with lawyers where he seemed to understand little. Some days he did not appear at all, his absence explained by health claims. On those days the lawyers argued over his competence more than over his guilt. In chambers and sidebars, judges faced a hard choice. They had a duty to protect the rights of defendants who were truly unable to help in their own defense. The law did not like to punish the deeply confused, yet they also had a duty to ensure that elaborate performances did not become permanent shields for those who had the resources to assemble them. Years of delays and evaluations had already slowed the wheels. By the middle of the 1990s, patience was thinning. When their major racketeering case finally went to trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was of strained focus. Jurors listened as witnesses described concrete businesses, fish markets, union halls, construction sites. They learned about the window contracts, the no-show jobs, the quiet envelopes. They also heard about the odd walks in the village, the bathrobe and slippers, the mumbling and wandering. The prosecution urged them to see the madness as an act. The defense insisted it was real. In the jury room, ordinary citizens, removed from their own jobs and families for the duration, weighed these competing stories. They could not be sure of every detail, no one could, but they could see patterns. They could see that the hospital stays always seemed to cluster around court dates. They could see that, despite repeated reports of confusion, Vincent had somehow managed to maintain complex family arrangements, financial interests, and long-term associations. In the end, they returned with verdicts that cut through part of the fog. Guilty, they said, on multiple counts of racketeering and conspiracy. The sentence that followed was measured in years rather than in weeks, 12 years in federal custody, plus a fine that looked large in print but might have seemed smaller when weighed against a lifetime of earnings. For the agents who had spent cold nights in cars watching Sullivan Street, there was relief, not triumph exactly. The case had taken too long and cost too much energy for easy celebration. But there was a sense that something had finally landed. In the neighborhood, reactions were more complicated. At the deli on the corner, regulars shook their heads over newspapers. "They say he is going away," man remarked. "He is an old man," another replied. "What difference does it make now?" An older woman, the one who always seemed to know a little more than she let on, folded her paper neatly. "The difference," she said softly, "is that the story is changing. The city likes to rewrite its stories. In Old Tappan and on the Upper East Side, family members adjusted to the news in their own ways. Some felt anger at a system that would take a grandfather away when he was already frail. Others felt a quieter anger at the choices that had led to this point. A few mixed their feelings with a strange, guilty relief. The waiting, the constant tension of not knowing if or when he would be taken away was finally over. Vincent was transferred into the custody of the Bureau of Prisons and eventually to a medical centre designed for inmates with serious health issues. There, in a facility in Springfield, Missouri, life took on a different rhythm. Instead of the familiar streets of the village or the quiet lanes of New Jersey, his days were bounded by institutional walls and schedules. Nurses walked the halls at regular intervals, medications were dispensed in small cups, meals arrived on trays that looked the same no matter the day. Some of the staff knew who he was, others saw only another older man with a complicated file and a long shadow. For a while, even behind those walls, the performance continued in smaller ways. Visitors came, carefully vetted and watched. Some were family, bringing news of birthdays and holidays missed. Some were old associates, now careful not to say too much even in private, aware that ears could be anywhere. Conversations often slid into half-remembered talk of the past. Vincent would complain about headaches, about confusion, about being lost between times. Then, for a few minutes, he would snap into focus and ask about specific people and specific places, his questions too precise to belong to a man entirely lost. Prosecutors had not quite finished with him, even after the racketeering conviction. One strand remained. For years, the government believed that the Insanity Act was not only a defense but a crime in itself. If he had deliberately misled courts and doctors, if he had instructed others to support a false portrait of his mental state, then he had obstructed justice in a deliberate, organized ways. They built a case on that theory. Family members were questioned about instructions to feign confusion. Associates were asked whether they had been told to reinforce the idea that the boss was too sick to function. The web of hospital visits and delays was examined not as symptom, but as strategy. In 2003, already deep into his sentence and into his old age, Vincent was brought once more into a courtroom. The man who sat at the defense table this time was thinner than before, shoulders narrower, hair more obviously grey. Yet his eyes, when he looked up, still had a certain steady weight. The charge was obstruction of justice. The question was simple in structure, if not in emotion. Had he, over many years, deliberately pretended to be far more mentally ill than he truly was, in order to avoid trials and confuse investigations? The answer came in the form of a plea. After his lawyers negotiated the shape of the agreement, Vincent stood, with help, and spoke softly. Yes, he said in effect, he had played up his problems. Yes, he had exaggerated his confusion. Yes, he had instructed others to support that portrayal. He admitted that much of the bathrobe and hospital routine had been part of a long-running effort to mislead the justice system. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand confessions, just a few careful sentences that mattered enormously. For the agents and prosecutors who had spent years battling the fog, it felt like a curtain being pulled back. They would not get back the lost time, but they had something they rarely received in such cases: acknowledgement. The odd father, the man who had walked through the village in slippers muttering at lampposts, had finally admitted that a significant portion of that behaviour had been deliberate. To some observers, this was simply one more plea bargain, one more tactical surrender in a life full of manoeuvres. To others, it felt like a small but important flicker of truth. For Vincent himself, standing there with the weight of age and illness pressing on his shoulders, it may have been something quieter, a settling of accounts, not in the moral sense that preachers talk about, but in the practical sense that men of his world understood. The system had cornered him at last on this one point. There was no longer any advantage in insisting on the old story. To fight on would have meant dragging his family and his name through more hearings for little gain. So he let the story shift. The man who once trained his body to stand in front of an opponent in the ring had spent decades training his mind to slip away from grasp. Now, near the end, he admitted that much of that slipping had been a controlled slide. The additional sentence for obstruction was relatively small compared to the years he was already serving. But in the history of the city, the moment echoed louder than the numbers on the page. On Sullivan Street, the car that used to wait under the crooked tree no longer sat there every night. The agents had moved on to other targets, other names. Still, sometimes when an older detective drove through the village on his way home, he would glance at that spot and remember the man in the bathrobe talking to parking meters. He would think of that voice in the courtroom, soft and deliberate, finally admitting that the talk had been part of a plan, and he would feel, in a quiet way, that one of the longest-running performances the city had ever seen had finally taken its bow. Chapter 10. Bathrobe at the End of the Hall. In the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, the nights had their own peculiar calm. The halls were lit with a steady, low brightness that never quite allowed full darkness. Doors clicked softly as nurses moved from room to room, checking pulses, dispensing medication, adjusting blankets. From some rooms came the soft sound of televisions, turned down low but never fully muted. From others, snores and restless mutters blended into a kind of institutional lullaby. In men's wing, behind a door with an ordinary number, Vincent Gigante walked down a short hallway in a thin robe and standard-issue slippers. It was not the heavy, familiar bathrobe from Sullivan Street. This one was lighter, hospital fabric, washed 100 times and frayed at the edges. Still, when he walked, the memory of his old route in the village seemed to echo in his steps. The corridor was only a few yards long, ending at a locked door with a small window. Beyond that window, another part of the facility stretched on. He did not go there. His world now was made of short distances. He shuffled back and forth, hands loose at his sides, head slightly lowered. Some nights he talked to himself in a low mutter. Snatches of Italian mixed with English. Old names surfaced and sank. Dates and places bumped against each other in his mind like boats in a crowded harbour. Other nights he was silent, the only sound the soft scuff of his slippers on the polished floor. Staff who watched him grew used to the sight. "That is the mob boss," one new nurse whispered to another during a break. The other glanced at the thin old man in the hallway. "That is an old man with heart trouble and bad knees," she said. "Whatever he was, he is mostly this now." Both were right in their own way. His file was thick, stuffed with reports from decades of investigations and from medical specialists. It told the story of a man who had once held sway over fortune and fear, who had helped steer unions, contracts, and crews across a vast city. It also told of chronic health conditions, of surgeries and strokes, of a gradual narrowing of his world. In the quiet periods between checks, he would sit in a plastic chair by the window in a small common room. The view outside was not of Greenwich Village or the Manhattan skyline. It was of a fenced yard, a patch of grass, a few trees that did their best under institutional care. Beyond the fence, Middle America rolled on with its own errands, mostly unaware that of New York's most famous underworld figures was sitting in a chair watching the sky. He did not receive as many visitors now. Family came when they could, making long trips to sit with him in fluorescent light. They brought small comforts, news of grandchildren, photographs of birthday parties and graduations. Their visits were filled with a mix of affection, regret, and practical talk about legal issues and health updates. Old associates rarely appeared in person. Those who were still alive and free understood that coming to a federal medical center to see a man like Vincent was like walking into the center of a web, feeling the vibration of every strand. They sent word when necessary through careful channels, but the days of long, relaxed visits were past. Sometimes, between visits, Vincent seemed to drift backward through his life. A nurse walking by his open door might hear him calling softly to people who were no longer alive, using nicknames that meant nothing to her and everything to the vanished men with whom he had once shared tables. On other afternoons he would speak clearly about the old neighborhood, describing the smell of bread on Thompson Street, the sound of church bells, the feel of a boxing glove tightened over his hand. Time, inside his head, no longer flowed in a straight line. One day, a chaplain from the facility stopped by his room. They spoke quietly. The chaplain had read some of the public accounts about him. He did not ask for confessions. He simply listened as Vincent wandered through memories, sometimes circling back to the same stories, sometimes skipping entire decades as if they were small puddles to be stepped over. If the chaplain looked closely, he could see in the older man's face brief flashes of the younger versions. The watchful kid from Thompson Street, the boxer pausing in a locker room, the quiet captain in a social club, the robe-clad walker in the village. All of them flickered behind the lined skin and tired eyes. Outside those walls, life moved on. In New York, new bosses rose and fell. Some tried different strategies, others repeated old mistakes. The city's skyline grew more crowded with glass towers. The streets of Greenwich Village filled with new boutiques, coffee shops, and tourists taking photographs under trees that had seen far stranger sights than their cameras could catch. The Triangle Civic Improvement Association closed its doors. The sign came down. The space changed hands, became something else, maybe a trendy bar or a small gallery. The ghosts of old meetings lingered in the air, but nobody stopped to listen. Sullivan Street's crooked tree still grew around the wires. New cars took the place of the old unmarked sedan beneath it. Neighbours moved in who had never heard the name Gigante in their lives. To them, the odd father was at most a line in a true crime documentary they half-watched one night. At St. Anthony of Padua Church on Houston Street, the pews filled and emptied as they always had. Weddings, baptisms, funerals. Candles were lit for small personal sorrows that never made the news. In that church, once upon a time, a priest named Louis had said Mass, a man of the cloth with a last name that matched Vincent's. The stories of the two brothers intertwined in the minds of older parishioners long after both had passed. Back in Springfield, Vincent's health continued its slow decline. There were days when he could walk the little hallway several times, each trip leaving him slightly more winded. There were other days when the nurses persuaded him to stay in bed, machines ticking softly nearby, a new kind of watchmaking. One early summer morning, the air already heavy with humidity, the medical centre grew a little quieter than usual in Watt's wing. Staff moved with a different kind of focus. A doctor checked a chart one more time, already knowing what it said. A nurse adjusted a sheet with a gentleness that came from long practice. In his bed, Vincent's breathing slowed, then stilled. There was no bathrobe this time, no shuffling walk, no murmured talk to walls and windows. Just the end of a long, complicated life in a room that looked much like any other in that facility. News of his passing travelled east in seconds. Reporters wrote short summaries, updating old files with a final date. They reminded readers of the bathrobe walks, of the insanity defense, of the racketeering convictions. They used phrases like reputed boss and legendary figure and controversial defense. On crime desks and in law enforcement offices, people who had spent careers in the shadow of names like his paused for a moment, then went back to their current cases. There was always another file on the desk. In Greenwich Village, the news arrived in quieter ways. At the deli, an old man reading a paper shook his head. So, he said, Chin is gone. The owner nodded. He was gone from here a long time ago, he replied. This is just the final notice. A few older neighbours, those who remembered watching the bathrobe walks from their windows, lit candles at St. Anthony. They did so not because they approved of everything he had done, but because he had been part of the fabric of their lives, another thread in the strange tapestry of the neighbourhood. At the funeral, held back in the city he had never truly left in his mind, the crowd was smaller than one might expect for a man of his reputation. Age and prison had thinned his circle. Some people stayed away out of caution, not wanting their presence noted. Others stayed away because time had washed their fears and loyalties into different shapes. Still, there were enough to fill a modest number of pews. Family members wept quietly. Old associates stood with hands clasped, faces set in that particular expression men wear when they are thinking of a dozen things at once but showing none of them. The priest spoke in general terms about life, about choices, about mystery. He did not recount Vincent's deeds in detail. He talked instead about the boy born to immigrants on Thompson Street, about family, about the complicated nature of mercy. Outside the church, the city went on. Cabs passed, buses sighed at their stops. A couple argued softly on the corner about nothing that would matter in a week. A young artist, headphones on, hurried past with a portfolio under his arm, unaware that he had walked by the farewell to a man whose shadow had once stretched across entire blocks. Years later, new agents joined federal task forces focused on organized crime. During training, they were shown old photographs. "This is Vincent Gigante," an instructor would say. They called him the Odd Father. He pretended to be deeply mentally ill for years, walking around in a bathrobe, muttering in the street, checking in and out of hospitals. The young agents would look at the pictures, half amused, half impressed. Did it work, one would ask? For a while, the instructor would say, long enough that some cases were delayed, some charges complicated. But in the end, he went to prison. In the end, he admitted the act. Remember that when you watch someone who thinks they are cleverer than the system, time has its own way of closing circles. On a different night, in a different unmarked car, on a different quiet street, a pair of younger agents might find themselves watching another doorway. They would sip coffee, trade stories, glance at the clock on the dashboard. One might mention the legend of the man in the bathrobe on Sullivan Street, the boss who used confusion as a shield. The other would shrug. Every era has its own performances, he would say. Our job is to see through them. Still, as they looked out at the sleeping city, they might feel a strange kinship with the earlier watchers. Stakeouts changed technology, not posture. Back in the village, someone new lived in the apartment where Vincent had once begun his nightly walks. They had repainted the walls, replaced the fixtures, maybe even pulled up the old floors. The building carried his memory the way old stone carries old heat, quietly, without announcement. On some autumn evening when the light slants just so and the air smells faintly of rain and bakery and distant traffic, you might stand on Sullivan Street and almost imagine you see, for a heartbeat, a figure in a worn robe turning the corner. Then a cyclist would zip past, or a dog would bark, and the vision would dissolve into the ordinary noise of the present. The city keeps its secrets, but it does not stop moving. Vincent Gigante's life, from the tenements of Thompson Street to the quiet ward in Springfield, traced a line through some of the most hidden corridors of that motion. He had been many things in that time: a son watching a watchmaker, a kid learning to slip punches in a smoky gym, a messenger with envelopes, a trusted executor of dangerous messages, a captain with a crew of his own, a quiet boss behind louder men, a patient in hospital corridors, a shuffling figure in a bathrobe on village sidewalks, an inmate in a distant medical center. To the people who built cases against him, he was a problem to solve. To those who lived under his influence, he was a force to be navigated. To his family, he was a complicated presence, both protector and source of constant unease. To the city itself, he was out more character in its long parade of masked figures. In the end, the bathrobe hung on a hook somewhere, empty. The hallways he once paced, both in New York and in Springfield, found new feet to wear down their tiles. The legend remained, but legends are weightless. They cannot lean on windowsills, or sit at deli counters, or shuffle past the crooked tree under the watchful eyes of tired agents. Those duties belong to living men, in new suits and new disguises, thinking that they have discovered some new trick. The quiet lesson from Vincent's long story is that every disguise has a shelf life, every performance meets its audience, every watch, no matter how carefully repaired, runs down. On some later night, in some other part of the city, a trainee might doze lightly in the passenger seat of a parked car, while an older partner watches a doorway. The older one might say, without taking his eyes off the building, "Let me tell you about the time we watched a man in a bathrobe for years." The trainee would laugh, then lean back to listen, the soft hum of the city around them, the streetlights turning the windows to pale squares of light, and somewhere, in the long memory of New York, the footsteps of the odd father would echo faintly, part of the background music, no longer frightening, just another rhythm under the city's restless heart.